The sun had barely started to dip behind the hills when I pulled up to the cabin. It was a small place, weathered by time, sitting at the edge of a thick forest in the Appalachian Mountains, somewhere in eastern Kentucky. I'd rented it for the weekend, looking for solitude, a chance to unwind from the grind of work, the noise of the city. Just me, the trees, and a bit of quiet, or so I thought. I stepped out of my truck, the gravel crunching under my boots, and took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. It smelled fresh, like pine and earth, but also like something else. Something faintly musty, like old wood and dampness. The cabin was made of logs, with a porch running along the front and a single light flickering above the door. I could see a small creek in the distance, its gentle murmur barely audible above the wind rustling through the trees. The cabin didn't seem like much. A little rundown, maybe. There were a few broken shingles on the roof, the porch had some peeling paint, and the windows were old, fogged up at the edges. It wasn't the perfect vacation spot by any means, but it was exactly what I was looking for. Quiet, isolated. I grabbed my bag from the truck and made my way inside. The door creaked when I opened it, the hinges rusty, but it didn't take much effort to get in. The smell hit me as soon as I crossed the threshold. Wood, dust, and something I couldn't quite place. It didn't smell rotten, just stale. The interior was just as simple as the outside. The main room had a fireplace on one side, a couch that looked like it had seen better days, and a small kitchen off to the left. There was an old wooden dining table with mismatched chairs, and the floors were creaky, like they hadn't been sanded in decades. I dropped my bag on the couch and took a moment to look around, getting a feel for the place. Felt safe enough. Lonely, yes, but peaceful. After a few minutes, I went to the kitchen and found the basics. A fridge that looked ancient, a stove with a couple of burners that seemed functional, and a sink that had a slow drain. There were some canned goods in the pantry and a few bottles of water in the fridge. Perfect for a weekend alone. I wasn't planning on doing much cooking, just simple meals. I'd come for the solitude, not the amenities. The first night was quiet, nothing out of the ordinary. I sat by the fireplace for a while, reading a book I'd brought along. The crackle of the flames was the only sound besides the occasional gust of wind outside. Every now and then, I would hear a thud from somewhere in the cabin. I figured it was just the house settling. It was old after all. But as the night wore on, I started to feel something. A creeping unease that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the isolation, the silence, or the way the wind howled outside. But I started to get the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. It wasn't until I was about to head to bed that I heard the first unmistakable noise. A scraping sound like something dragging across the floor. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Came from the back of the cabin, from the bedroom. I was sure of it. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept toward the hallway, trying to keep my footsteps as silent as possible. The sound came again, faint but clear. Something heavy, dragging slowly. My stomach turned. I was alone in this cabin. I knew I was. The thought of someone else being here, that wasn't possible. I reached the door to the bedroom and hesitated, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light flickered once before I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the windows closed tight, and nothing appeared out of place. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was nothing. The wind, or an animal, something outside. My nerves were getting the best of me. I shut the door and went back to the living room, sitting down on the couch, trying to push the feeling out of my mind. But then, the scraping noise came again, louder this time. I was certain it came from the kitchen, followed by a thud. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the flashlight and stood up. Every step I took toward the kitchen felt heavier, like I was walking through water. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? Was someone really in here with me? I reached the kitchen doorway and stopped. The room was dark, but I could just make out shapes in the gloom. The flashlight beam landed on the floor near the back door. And there, in the dim light, I saw something that froze me in place. A trail of dirt and leaves, smeared across the floor, leading from the back door to the far corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat. The door was locked when I got here. I had checked it myself. There was no way anyone could have come in without me hearing them. The dirt, it was like something had been dragged through the cabin. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, and every instinct screamed at me to get out. But where would I go? The cabin was isolated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and it was dark. I didn't have a phone signal out here. My only choice was to stay inside and wait until daylight. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, the flashlight in my hand, listening for any sound that might suggest someone. Something was nearby, but the rest of the night passed without incident. The scraping sound stopped, and I was left with only my nervous thoughts for company. The next morning, I woke up early, the sun just beginning to rise. I felt exhausted, but I knew I needed to check the cabin again. I couldn't just let it go. The dirt trail was still there, but there was something else now. A small pile of leaves near the back door, piled up almost like it had been intentionally placed there. I couldn't make sense of it. My heart was still pounding from the previous night, and every little noise seemed to send me into a panic. But I couldn't stay on edge forever. I had to finish what I came here to do. I decided to head into town, even though it wasn't much of a town. A few miles down the road, there was a small convenience store, and I needed to clear my head. I needed to talk to someone, to make sure I wasn't going crazy. When I got there, I didn't say much at first, just grabbed some snacks and a soda. The clerk, an older woman, looked up at me with a knowing gaze. "Cabin by the creek?" she asked, as if she already knew. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, is there something about it?" She just smiled a little, a hint of something I couldn't quite place in her eyes. "Just be careful," she said. "Cabins out there have a way of getting to people." I wasn't sure what she meant, but it only added to the growing unease I felt. I paid for my things and left, heading back to the cabin with a feeling of dread in my stomach. When I got back, everything seemed normal. The dirt trail was still there, but no other signs of disturbance. I spent the rest of the day outside, trying to get some fresh air, walking by the creek, doing my best to ignore the heavy feeling that kept pressing down on me. By the time evening came, I was sitting on the porch, trying to enjoy the sunset. But the quiet wasn't comforting anymore. The silence pressed in on me, making my skin crawl. I thought I saw something moving in the trees, just out of the corner of my eye. I stood up, heart racing, but when I looked, nothing was there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up until dawn, listening to the wind and the creaks of the cabin. But as the first light of morning broke through the trees, I felt better. I don't know why. Maybe it was the fact that I'd survived the night. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't heard that scraping sound again. I packed up my things and left the cabin that morning, not looking back. I didn't know what had been going on, what I had heard, or why it felt so wrong. All I knew was that I wasn't sticking around to find out. The road back to the town felt like a release, a breath of fresh air after weeks of holding my breath. The cabin stayed behind, silent and empty, its old wood creaking in the wind. But for me, it would always remain a mystery. Something about it was wrong, and I would never quite shake the feeling that I wasn't alone that night. The cabin sat in a remote stretch of woods, nestled on the edge of a thick forest. I had rented it for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the noise of city life. The year was 2023, and I was in my late 20s, just a regular guy looking for some peace and quiet. I didn't expect much, just a few days to recharge, get some fresh air, and maybe even do a little hiking if I was up for it. I didn't think the weekend would turn into something I'd never forget. The drive to the cabin was long. I had rented a car for the trip, leaving my apartment in the city behind. The last few miles had been on a narrow, winding dirt road, where the trees crowded in close, their branches nearly blocking out the sunlight. It was the kind of place where you could feel the isolation, like the rest of the world didn't exist anymore. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was a little relieved to see it. A small, one-story building with a wooden porch, just as the listing had shown. It wasn't much, but it looked cozy enough. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. There was no one else around for miles, no other cabins in sight. The nearest town was about an hour's drive away, and there was no cell service. It felt peaceful, like I had stepped into a world where time moved slower. The cabin was older than I expected. The wood was weathered, but not in a way that made it look abandoned, just well used. The door creaked as I opened it, and the smell inside was a mix of old wood and something faintly musty, like the place hadn't been aired out in a while. It was clean enough, though, and everything seemed to be in order. There was a small living area with a couch, a stone fireplace, and a wooden coffee table. The kitchen had all the basics: a stove, a fridge, a sink, and some pots and pans. The bedroom was at the back of the cabin, and there was a small bathroom off to the side. It wasn't luxurious, but it would do. After unpacking my things, I decided to head outside and explore the surroundings. The weather was nice, cool enough to be comfortable but not too cold. The woods stretched out behind the cabin, dense and full of life. The air was clean, and the forest was quiet, aside from the occasional bird call. I walked for a while, just enjoying the solitude, letting the peace of the place settle over me. That evening, after I cooked a simple meal, I sat outside on the porch with a beer, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky turned a deep purple, and the first stars began to appear. It was beautiful, almost surreal, how quiet it was. No traffic, no people, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I knew I'd made the right choice by coming here. That night, I slept soundly, the kind of deep sleep that only comes when you're far removed from the stress of daily life. The bed was comfortable enough, and the warmth from the wood stove kept the cabin cozy. But the next morning, something was off. It wasn't anything huge, just little things. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. I got up early, around 6 a.m., when the sky was still dark, the air chilly. The silence outside seemed heavier, like the world was holding its breath. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and watched as the sky slowly brightened. But there was no movement in the woods, no birds, no animals. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe it was just early, and decided to go for a hike. There was a trail that ran through the woods, marked by a few scattered signs, and I thought it would be a good way to stretch my legs. The forest seemed darker today, the trees more oppressive, though it wasn't anything that made me feel truly uneasy, just different. I'd hiked before, and the woods were nothing new to me, but as I walked, I started to notice something strange. The forest was too quiet, the usual sounds of animals and insects absent. It was almost as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I kept walking, my boots crunching on the forest floor. The trees grew denser as I went deeper into the woods, their branches reaching up like fingers, blocking out more and more of the sky. The trail twisted and turned, winding its way through the dense underbrush. I lost track of time, but I didn't care. I was alone, and the feeling of being so far removed from civilization was both comforting and unsettling. The silence was almost suffocating, like the woods were hiding something from me. Eventually, I came across something I hadn't expected. An old, decaying shack. It was half hidden in the trees, its roof caved in, and the wood was rotting, the whole structure on the verge of falling apart. The door hung off its hinges, and I felt an odd mix of curiosity and caution wash over me. I stepped closer, but something about the place didn't feel right. I should have turned around then, but for some reason I didn't. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning with age. Inside, the air was damp and musty, the smell of mold thick in the air. There was nothing much left inside, just a few old, broken furniture pieces and scattered debris. But as I looked around, something caught my eye. A faded photograph lying on the floor near the corner. I bent down to pick it up, brushing the dust off the surface. The photo was old, black and white, showing a group of people standing in front of a cabin. There was no date, but the style of clothing suggested it was taken decades ago. The people in the photo looked normal enough, just a group of friends or family smiling for the camera. But there was something off about the image. In the background, barely visible, was another figure. Just a shadow, but enough to make my skin crawl. I couldn't make out any details, but I had a strange feeling that it was watching them. Watching me. I stood there for a moment, staring at the photo, my heart beating a little faster. The feeling that something wasn't right deepened, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. Without thinking, I turned and walked out of the shack. My steps hurried. The rest of the day passed slowly. I returned to the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The woods didn't seem as peaceful anymore. They felt oppressive, like they were watching me. I tried to push the thoughts aside, telling myself I was just imagining things, but I couldn't help it. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind outside, seemed louder than usual. I kept hearing noises, scratching at the door, footsteps on the porch. But when I would check, there was nothing there. It was all in my head, I told myself. But the unease wouldn't go away. The next morning, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of something moving around outside the cabin. I froze, my heart racing. The cabin wasn't much, but it felt like the kind of place that could be easily invaded. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. What I saw froze me in place. There, just beyond the tree line, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw that it was a man. He was standing motionless, staring at the cabin. His clothes were ragged, his hair wild. He looked like he hadn't seen civilization in years. I couldn't see his face clearly, but the way he stood there, unmoving, made my blood run cold. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I didn't know who he was or why he was out there, but I wasn't going to find out. I grabbed my keys, shoved them into my pocket, and ran out the door. I didn't even bother locking up the cabin. I made it to the car and sped down the dirt road, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the town, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew I wouldn't be returning to that cabin. Not ever. When I got home, I checked the old photograph again, just to see if I'd missed something. I zoomed in on the shadowy figure in the background. This time, I could see it more clearly. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a man who looked eerily familiar. The realization hit me like a punch. The man in the photograph looked exactly like the one I had seen standing outside the cabin. It was early October when I decided to take some time off and head into the woods. I was in my early 30s, working a desk job in a small town in northern Michigan, and the daily grind had been wearing me down. The idea of a quiet, remote cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. I rented the place for a week, just me and the forest, no distractions. The cabin was situated about an hour from the nearest town, perched on the edge of a thick pine forest, next to a small, stagnant lake. It was an old cabin, rustic and simple, with nothing more than a wood-burning stove for heat and a few basic amenities. But it had a charm, a solitude I was craving. When I first arrived, I thought the place was beautiful, perfect for what I needed. The air smelled fresh, clean, and the sound of the wind through the trees was oddly calming. The cabin was tucked away on a dirt road, with barely a trace of civilization in sight. The only neighbors were miles away, and there was no Wi-Fi or cell service. It felt like I was stepping into another world, one where time moved slower and people didn't matter. The owner of the cabin had left me a note on the counter when I arrived, giving me a few pointers about the wood stove and warning me about the occasional bear sighting in the area. There was also a map detailing some nearby hiking trails and a small dock near the lake. It looked like the perfect spot to relax, read, and disconnect. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my mornings walking through the woods, listening to the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the distant call of birds. I spent the afternoons sitting by the lake, reading, and watching the slow movement of the water. The evenings were spent by the fire in the cabin, cooking simple meals and watching the flames flicker in the stove. I felt a calm settling into me, the kind that only comes when you are far from everything. But as the days passed, I started to feel a strange unease creeping in. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a slight tension, a subtle awareness that I was alone in a place that had no one else around for miles. At night, the silence in the woods was so complete that it felt unnatural, like everything was holding its breath. The first incident happened on the third night. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was lying in bed, the soft sound of the wind outside barely noticeable. The fire in the stove had died down to glowing embers, and the only light in the cabin came from the moonlight filtering through the windows. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it. A noise outside. It was faint, at first, like something moving through the brush just beyond the cabin. I lay still, listening, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. The sound was heavier, deliberate, like someone walking through the woods, dragging something along with them. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but something about the rhythm of the sound felt wrong. I tried to shake it off, but my mind kept returning to it. The noise went on for several minutes, then stopped. I waited for a long time, listening. There was no more sound, just the night. I didn't sleep much that night, tossing and turning, feeling paranoid for no good reason. The next morning, I went outside to see if I could find any tracks or signs of what might have made the noise. There was nothing. The ground around the cabin was covered in thick pine needles, and the only traces of life were a few animal tracks in the mud near the lake. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The days went by, and each night, the unease grew. I heard the noises again, always just as I was about to fall asleep. Sometimes they were close, other times farther away. The worst part was that I never saw anything. No shadows in the trees, no figures moving through the woods, just the sound. And it wasn't just the walking anymore. It started to sound like something was scratching at the cabin's walls. By the fifth night, I was feeling on edge. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that the isolation and the quiet were messing with me, but I couldn't deny what I was hearing. That night, I decided to stay up. I sat in a chair by the window, the fire crackling softly behind me, listening to the darkness outside. The cabin creaked with the settling of wood, and the wind blew through the trees. Everything seemed normal at first. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the wood. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the woodshed. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, more deliberate. My heart raced in my chest. I stood up and crept to the door, my hand gripping the handle. I had no idea what I was going to do if I opened it. There was no one around for miles, and I was armed only with a small hunting knife that I'd brought along for peace of mind. I opened the door slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The moonlight was bright enough to illuminate the trees in the distance, but the area around the cabin was shrouded in shadow. The scraping stopped the moment the door cracked open. I stepped outside, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. I looked around, scanning the darkness. There was nothing. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then I saw it. A set of footprints, fresh in the mud near the woodshed. They were large, heavy footprints, and they weren't there when I checked earlier in the day. Whoever had made them had come close to the cabin. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The footsteps led into the woods, and I could hear nothing else. No rustling, no movement, just the wind. For some reason, I couldn't bring myself to go after them. I didn't want to find out who or what had been out there. Instead, I locked the door and stayed inside for the rest of the night, too scared to leave. The next morning, I packed up my things. I knew I couldn't stay another night in that cabin, not with the sense that someone or something was out there. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. As I loaded my car, I took one last look at the cabin, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure in the window. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the sight of it made my heart race. I drove away as fast as I could, not looking back until I reached the nearest town. When I got back to my apartment, I called the owner of the cabin to let them know what had happened. They seemed surprised but assured me that no one else had been up there recently. They suggested I might have heard an animal or something else, though that didn't explain the footsteps. I never went back to that cabin, but every once in a while, when I'm walking through the woods, I hear something, like a footstep, a branch breaking, or the sound of something dragging along the ground. And I always wonder if I was just imagining things, or if there really was someone out there that night. The wind was relentless as it howled through the trees, and I watched from the window of the old cabin as the first signs of night began to settle in. My fingers were stiff from holding the flashlight too long, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. There was something eerie about the way the forest seemed to be closing in around me. The tall, twisted trees had a way of making the night feel even darker, as if they were hiding something just beyond sight. I wasn't used to this kind of isolation, but I had chosen it. I'd always been someone who needed space, who needed quiet. I thought spending a weekend alone in this little cabin, located deep in the Appalachian Mountains, would give me the peace I was looking for. I was wrong. I had arrived earlier that afternoon, feeling the excitement of escaping the city. The drive up had been longer than expected, but I figured it was all part of the experience. When I first saw the cabin, it was quaint and old, nothing like the modern vacation homes I had grown accustomed to. The wood was weathered and peeling in places, but it had character. It was perfect for what I wanted, or so I thought. Inside, it wasn't much. A small living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a couple of bedrooms with threadbare furniture, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. There were no luxuries, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just the bare essentials. But that was the point. I had come to get away from everything. The cabin was situated at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense forest on every side. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. I loved it. That first evening, I spent my time unpacking, organizing my food, and starting a fire in the hearth. The smell of burning wood was comforting, and I felt a sense of calm as the flames crackled in the fireplace. After dinner, I went for a short walk around the cabin, taking in the beauty of the place. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear, with a scattering of stars twinkling above. As I walked further into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trees were dense here, their branches twisting and intertwining to block out most of the light. The ground was soft with moss, and the silence was almost oppressive. I had heard stories about people getting lost in these woods, but I wasn't worried. I was a seasoned hiker, and I had a good sense of direction. Still, I turned back after only a few minutes. Something about this place made me uneasy. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and settled in for the night. The wind outside was picking up, and I could hear the occasional creak of the cabin settling as the temperature dropped. I wrapped myself in a blanket and pulled a book from my bag, trying to relax, but my mind kept wandering back to the woods. There was something about them, something that felt wrong. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to the isolation. I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a thud. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from outside, near the back of the cabin. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, but I didn't want to make any noise. What if someone was out there? Someone who didn't belong? The wind was still howling, but it wasn't the wind making that noise. I could hear something moving around out there, something heavy. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a bear. But the noise didn't sound like anything natural. It was too deliberate, too calculated. I lay there, frozen, listening for any other sounds. The noise stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, waiting. Then it came again. A soft thud followed by a scraping sound, as though something was dragging itself along the ground. I felt a chill run down my spine. I waited a few minutes, my heart racing in my chest, before slowly standing up and reaching for the flashlight. My hand was shaking as I clicked it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. I crept toward the window and carefully pulled back the heavy curtain. For a moment, I didn't see anything. The forest beyond the cabin was still, the only movement coming from the wind shaking the branches. But then I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it was staring directly at me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, as though it was looking right into my soul. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Was it a person? A hunter, perhaps? But the way it stood there, motionless, made me think otherwise. I couldn't explain it, but there was something deeply unsettling about the figure. Something that made me feel like I wasn't supposed to be here. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed up, sitting in the corner of the room, clutching the flashlight in my hands. I didn't dare make a sound, not even the slightest movement. The figure was still there, watching. I couldn't tell how long it stayed, but eventually, I fell into a fitful sleep, only to wake with the first light of dawn. When I looked outside, the figure was gone, but the feeling of unease remained. It was as if the forest was pressing in on me, suffocating me with its silence. I packed up my things and decided to leave. I couldn't stay another night, but when I went to the front door, I found something strange. The doorknob had been twisted, as though someone had tried to open it. But the door hadn't been forced, and there was no sign of anyone having entered the cabin. I didn't know what to think. Was it just my imagination? Had I really seen someone out there? I left the cabin in a hurry, never looking back as I made my way down the long, winding road toward the nearest town. I didn't care if I left half my gear behind. I just wanted to get out of those woods. As I drove away, the wind continued to howl through the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me, waiting for me to return. I never thought I'd be the type of person to go on a solo trip to a cabin in the middle of nowhere. My name's Ethan. I'm 29 years old and live in the city, working a regular 9-to-5 job. But after a long year of work and stress, I decided I needed a break. Somewhere quiet, where no one could reach me. No calls, no emails, just peace. I found a cabin listed online, tucked away in the woods just outside of Bear Creek, a small town in upstate New York. The listing promised seclusion, beautiful views of the forest, and an old, rustic charm. The price was affordable, and the reviews were all glowing, perfect for an escape. It took me nearly 5 hours to drive from the city to the cabin. The roads were narrow and winding, with trees growing so close they almost seemed to lean over the path. As I got closer, the last bit of the drive was a dirt road, and the GPS signal started to fade, leaving me to navigate by instinct. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dense forest, and I could hear the sound of crunching leaves under my tires. When I finally arrived, I was relieved to see the cabin standing there, just as the pictures showed. It was small, with a slanted roof and a wide front porch, surrounded by trees on all sides. A couple of wooden chairs sat on the porch, facing the forest. A small stream ran behind the cabin, and I could hear the gentle rush of water. I unloaded my bags and stepped inside. The cabin was old but well kept. The wood had that unmistakable smell of pine, and the interior was cozy, with a stone fireplace and a small kitchen. The furniture was simple but comfortable. I felt a wave of relaxation wash over me. For the first time in a long while, I felt at ease. That first evening was calm. I made a simple meal, lit the fireplace, and settled in with a book. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I remember feeling that perfect sense of solitude. No distractions, no responsibilities, just the quiet of nature. But as the night wore on, I began to notice something strange. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a slight discomfort in the air, as if the stillness of the woods had grown too thick. I shrugged it off, blaming my city-bred nerves. The wind picked up outside, causing the trees to sway and groan, but I didn't think much of it. I was alone, but I told myself I was safe. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head to bed. The cabin was completely dark except for the soft glow of the fire, and as I lay in the small bedroom, I tried to calm my mind. But there was something off. Every now and then, I heard the sound of something moving outside. Not a wind-driven branch, but something heavier. A thud, then another. almost like footsteps. At first, I assumed it was an animal, perhaps a deer or some other creature, moving quietly through the woods. I kept my flashlight nearby just in case, but after a while, the noises grew louder, closer. It was as though something was circling the cabin. My heart started to race. I told myself it was nothing. After all, the cabin was secluded, wildlife was common in these parts. I tried to ignore the noise, but it wasn't easy. The more I tried to relax, the more aware I became of every creak in the cabin, every rustle outside. I finally drifted off to sleep, only to be woken up by a loud bang against the side of the cabin. My eyes snapped open, and my heart skipped a beat. I could hear my breath echoing in the silence. The banging came again, harder this time, like someone or something was hitting the walls. Panic set in. I grabbed my flashlight and jumped out of bed, moving quickly to the window. I shone the beam outside, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. My nerves were fraying, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped. I waited, barely breathing, listening intently for any sound that would confirm my fear. But there was nothing. Slowly, I returned to bed, telling myself that it was just the wind, that it was nothing more than the natural sounds of a forest at night. Still, sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, the sun was up, and the cabin was bathed in light. It felt almost surreal, like the events of the night before had been a bad dream. I decided to go for a hike to clear my head and stretch my legs. The air was fresh, the birds were chirping, and the forest was alive with sounds that seemed far less threatening in the daylight. I took a trail that led deeper into the woods, following it along the edge of the stream that ran behind the cabin. The trees were thick, their leaves shimmering in the sunlight. It was beautiful, tranquil, the kind of nature I'd been craving. I spent hours walking, lost in the peace of it all. But as I turned a bend in the trail, I found something that made my stomach drop. A campsite. It wasn't far from the cabin, hidden by the trees, but clearly visible once I was close enough. There were remnants of a fire pit, and nearby, some old tarps were hanging between trees. But it wasn't the campsite itself that made me uneasy. It was the fresh footprints leading to and from it. They were big, heavy, and recent, likely made in the past day or two. They were the kind of footprints that didn't belong to any animal I recognized. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the footprints led directly toward the cabin. It didn't make sense. Why would someone be out here so close to my cabin without any obvious reason? I didn't want to linger. I turned and headed back to the cabin, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. When I returned to the cabin, I locked the door behind me. I checked every window, made sure everything was in place. I even went outside to look around, but there was nothing unusual. The cabin sat quietly, as it always had. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I decided to take extra precautions. I moved a heavy chair in front of the door and made sure the windows were secure. I didn't expect anyone to break in, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I set up my flashlight next to the bed, just in case. Around midnight, I heard it again. That same noise, the sound of something hitting the side of the cabin. This time, it was harder, more deliberate. The noise echoed through the walls, rattling the wood. My pulse quickened, and I grabbed the flashlight, turning it on. I quickly scanned the room, but the cabin was dark and still. I knew then that I wasn't imagining it. Whoever or whatever was out there was trying to get in. I didn't have a phone signal, and there was no way to call for help. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I felt trapped. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to think of my options. After a few moments, the banging stopped again. I waited. My mind raced. Should I go outside to confront it? Should I stay inside and lock myself in? I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, I heard a soft voice from outside. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it was unmistakable. Someone was out there, talking, but it was so low, so faint, that I couldn't understand what they were saying. I froze. The voice came again, just as soft, almost like a whisper. It felt like the woods themselves were pressing in on me. The weight of the silence, the unknown, everything was suffocating. Without thinking, I grabbed the key to the cabin and slipped out the back door. I moved quietly, trying not to make a sound. The woods were eerily still, the only sound being the crunch of leaves underfoot. My heart was in my throat as I crept through the trees, heading toward the road. I reached the main road about 15 minutes later, and as I looked back at the cabin in the distance, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was just a silhouette against the moonlit backdrop. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew in my gut that I was no longer alone. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. Eventually, I made it back to Bear Creek. My heart was pounding as I entered the small town. I found a local inn and paid for a room, deciding I couldn't go back to the cabin. Not tonight, not after what I saw. The next day, I called the police and told them about the strange footprints, the noises, and the figure I'd seen in the woods. They promised to look into it, but I'm not sure they believed me. They thought it was probably someone camping nearby, but I knew better. When I finally made my way back to the cabin to pack up and leave, I found the door wide open. The heavy chair I had moved in front of it was pushed aside, and the place was ransacked. Whoever had been out there knew exactly what they were doing. I left, and I haven't been back to that cabin since. Now, I tell people my story, and I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I'm certain that something or someone was watching me that night, and I'll never forget the way the woods seemed to close in on me, the whispers in the trees, and the figure standing just beyond the shadows. I may never know the truth, but I know one thing for sure. The cabin sat nestled in the woods, far from any nearby neighbors or towns. I had come here for some peace and quiet, a retreat from the constant buzz of my everyday life. It was the beginning of October, the air crisp and cool with the promise of the coming winter. My name is Alex, and I'm 32 years old. I had booked this cabin through a website, looking for a place to escape the noise of the city for a few days. When I pulled up, the place seemed perfect, just isolated enough to feel like an escape, but not too far that I couldn't get help if I needed it. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't like the quiet of a city night, where you can still hear distant traffic or the hum of streetlights. No, this was the kind of silence that swallowed everything. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, no distant animal sounds. The kind of silence that presses on your ears until you start hearing your own heartbeat. The cabin itself was an old, wooden structure built some time ago, maybe in the 70s, maybe earlier. There were signs of wear and tear. The paint peeling from the walls, the roof a little sagging. But it wasn't falling apart, not by any means. The place had character. I liked that. It gave the feeling that I wasn't just staying in a house, but in something that had its own history, its own stories. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the old, stone fireplace. It crackled and popped, sending warmth into the cold air of the cabin. As the sun set, the world outside seemed to grow even quieter, and the chill in the air deepened. I sat in front of the fire, sipping on some coffee, and thought about how lucky I was to have this time to myself. But then, something unusual happened. I heard a noise outside, a faint but distinct sound like something dragging along the ground. My first thought was that it was some animal, maybe a deer or a bear, dragging a branch or something. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just nature doing its thing. But then the noise came again, this time louder, more deliberate. It was coming from behind the cabin. I sat up, my heart beating a little faster. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I was curious. The cabin was in a pretty remote area, and I didn't expect anyone else to be around. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up, feeling the cool air of the room rush past me as I walked toward the back door. As I stepped outside, I immediately noticed how dark it was. The kind of dark where you can't see your own hand in front of your face, even if it's right there. I flicked on the flashlight and swept it across the yard, but there was nothing. The trees stood still, their dark branches stretching high into the sky. The air smelled of earth and pine. I checked behind the cabin, but there was nothing there, just a small clearing and the thick woods beyond. I stood there for a moment, listening. The dragging sound had stopped. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. I was alone in the woods, after all. It was easy to start imagining things, especially when you're trying to relax. I turned back to the cabin and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house made me stir. Every shift in the wind outside had me listening intently. I didn't feel in danger, but there was an unease that lingered. The fire had died down, leaving the room in a dull, gray light. My watch showed that it was just past midnight. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my racing thoughts. And then the noise came again. At first, it was faint, like the scraping of something across the floor, but it grew louder, more pronounced. I sat up quickly, listening intently. The sound was coming from inside the cabin. The floorboards creaked as if someone or something was walking around. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the sound, but it was coming from the far corner of the room. My heart raced, and I felt the cold sweat start to trickle down my back. No one should have been there. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and the door had been locked. I got up slowly, feeling the floor shift under my feet with each step. The light from my flashlight barely illuminated the darkness ahead. I reached the corner of the room, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. My eyes scanned the area, looking for whatever was causing the noise. Nothing. I checked the windows, but they were still sealed shut. The door was locked, and there were no other exits. I even checked the chimney. It wasn't big enough for anyone to climb down, and the fire had gone out hours ago. The sound stopped, as if it had never been there in the first place. I went back to bed, but this time, I pulled the blankets tightly around me, the feeling of unease still pressing in on me. I eventually fell asleep, but it wasn't peaceful. I dreamt of the noise, of dragging sounds and things moving in the darkness. The next morning, I went about my day as planned. I took a long walk through the woods, breathing in the cool air, trying to shake off the lingering unease. I didn't tell anyone about the night's events. It felt foolish, really, to get worked up over nothing. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the noise came back. This time, it wasn't just dragging. There were footsteps, clear, deliberate footsteps, someone walking around the cabin. I didn't hesitate this time. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was colder now, and the wind had picked up, rustling the branches of the trees. I searched the yard with the beam of light, but again, there was nothing. Just the trees, the shadows, the silence. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind, but then I saw it. Near the edge of the clearing, something was moving. At first, it looked like a figure, but it was too blurry, too fast for me to make out. I took a step forward, but it disappeared into the woods. My mind raced. Was it a person, or was it just an animal? I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, but the fear wouldn't let me. I went back inside the cabin and locked the door behind me. I checked the windows again, the door, everything. The night passed in silence. The next morning, I left the cabin. I didn't feel safe anymore. The whole place, once peaceful and isolated, now felt like a trap. My car was parked just a short walk from the cabin, and I could feel the tension ease as I approached it. I started the engine and drove away without looking back. As I left, I couldn't help but think about the woods behind the cabin, and the feeling I had that something was still out there waiting. The cold wind whipped through the trees, causing the branches to creak and groan, their skeletal limbs scraping the sky. I stood on the edge of the clearing, staring at the small cabin ahead, nestled in the dark woods of northern Michigan. It had been a long drive, and now, after hours of winding roads, I had finally arrived at what was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a retreat from the noise and chaos of my everyday life. The cabin looked worn, but sturdy. It wasn't a grand place, just a modest structure built with logs, the kind you might expect in a place like this. The wood was weathered and gray, with a thin layer of moss growing in the cracks. but it felt welcoming in its own way. I had rented this place for a week to disconnect, to clear my mind after a difficult year. I had told myself it would be good for me, but now, standing here, I wasn't so sure. The isolation of the place felt heavier than I had anticipated, and the silence of the forest around me was unnerving. I grabbed my bags from the back of my truck and made my way toward the cabin. The air smelled of pine and earth, but there was something else too. Something faint like damp wood or mildew. As I stepped up to the porch, I noticed that the steps creaked under my weight, the wood splintering in places where the boards had aged and decayed. I paused, looking around, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up my spine. The cabin was small, but there was a charm to it. A small stone chimney rose from the roof, and there was a pile of wood neatly stacked beside the door. The windows were simple, with faded curtains hanging inside. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the scent of dust and stale air greeted me. The place had clearly been empty for a while. There was a stone fireplace along the far wall, and a few mismatched chairs scattered around a small wooden table. The walls were lined with old photographs of people I didn't recognize, their faces frozen in time. The cabin's interior was simple, just the basics, really. A few chairs, a small kitchen with an old stove, and a couple of bedrooms tucked away in the back. The bed in the master room had a thick quilt on it, and the window there looked out over the dense forest, where the trees grew so close together it felt like they were watching me. I didn't have any real plans for the night, just to settle in, maybe light a fire, and enjoy the peace and quiet. After unpacking my things, I grabbed some firewood and set it in the fireplace. The crackling of the logs soon filled the room, and the warmth of the fire made the cabin feel more like home. I leaned back in one of the old chairs, staring into the flames, listening to the occasional crack of the logs as they shifted. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The air seemed to grow colder as the night wore on, and I felt a shiver run through me. I tried to focus on the fire, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange feeling I had when I first arrived. Something was off, though I couldn't quite place it. The longer I sat in the cabin, the more the silence began to press in on me. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I had imagined. It was more like a suffocating hush, as if the forest was holding its breath. I decided to go to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would shake the odd feeling. As I climbed into the bed, I pulled the quilt up around me and tried to settle in. The fire in the living room was still crackling, and I could hear the wind howling outside, but I was too tired to stay awake. Slowly, I drifted off, the unsettling quiet of the cabin lulling me into a restless sleep. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. My heart began to race as I listened, straining to hear anything more. The footsteps were close, too close. I sat up in bed, my breath shallow as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But the sound continued, circling the cabin, moving along the walls, coming closer. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the window. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I peered out, scanning the dark woods. Nothing, just the empty trees and the inky blackness of the night. I slowly exhaled, trying to calm my nerves, but something about the stillness unsettled me. The footsteps had stopped. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, my eyes flicking to the window every time I heard a noise. By morning, I was exhausted, but the strange events of the night had made me more determined to stay. I couldn't leave now, not after coming all this way. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the isolation and the eeriness of the cabin playing tricks on me. The next day, I went for a hike through the woods. The sun was shining, and the air was crisp, but even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking behind the trees. But there was nothing, just the quiet forest stretching out in all directions. Still, I couldn't shake the paranoia that gnawed at me. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was more than ready to be inside, away from the oppressive silence of the woods. That evening, I decided to make a hearty dinner, something to keep my mind off the unease that had been creeping in. I lit a fire in the stove, chopped some vegetables, and threw them into a pot. The warmth of the kitchen was comforting, and the smell of the stew filled the cabin. I ate in silence, the only sound the occasional crack of the fire. But as I finished my meal, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost like a tap, but then it came again, louder this time. My heart skipped a beat. No one was supposed to be out here. I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. I stood frozen, staring at the door, my pulse hammering in my chest. The knock came again, insistent now, as if someone or something was waiting for me to answer. I had no choice. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the door, my hands shaking. When I opened it, there was no one there. Just the empty porch, the night air swirling in the trees. I stepped outside, scanning the darkness. There was nothing, no sign of anyone having been here. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in quick gasps as I stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do. I checked the rest of the cabin, locked every window, and barricaded the door. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still out there, watching me. The next morning, I packed up my things, determined to leave. The thought of spending another night in that cabin, alone, was more than I could handle. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin in the rearview mirror. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and I had the distinct impression that I wasn't the only one who had been in those woods. When I got back to the city, I tried to push the memories of that cabin from my mind, but the feeling of being watched never quite left me. I never went back to that cabin. The woods had swallowed up whatever secrets they held, and I was just another stranger who had crossed their threshold, only to leave again. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I still hear those footsteps in the distance, echoing in my mind, and I wonder if I ever really left at all. The cabin sat at the edge of the forest, far enough from the nearest town to be considered isolated, yet close enough to still be accessible by a dirt road. I had driven up alone to spend a long weekend away from the bustle of the city, thinking it would be a chance to unwind, recharge, and enjoy the peaceful solitude. I was in my mid-30s, a little tired from work, but otherwise fine, nothing extraordinary. The plan was simple. Get away from it all, enjoy the fresh air, read a few books, and just relax in the quiet. But it was the quiet that would soon start to weigh heavily on me. The first night, I arrived after dusk. The sky had been thick with clouds all day, and the sun had already set by the time I parked my car in front of the small, wooden cabin. It looked old but sturdy, its wooden exterior darkened with age, and the small windows barely letting any light through. Still, it was charming, and I was glad to be there. I carried my bag inside, dropped it on the rough-hewn wooden floor, and began unpacking. The cabin smelled of pine and dust, the kind of scent that would usually feel comforting. But tonight, it just seemed to fill the space with something a little heavier, a little more oppressive. I lit the fire in the stove, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The cold night air outside only added to the feeling. The wind howled through the trees, pushing against the cabin like it was trying to get inside. It wasn't the typical forest wind I was used to. This felt different, felt alive. Still, I brushed it off as just nerves. It was a new place, and everything felt unfamiliar. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been this far out in the wilderness. The farthest I'd gone before was a couple of campsites near the city. This, though, was deeper in the woods, an hour from any kind of real civilization. The quiet was almost unnerving, but that was what I had come for, wasn't it? To get away from the noise of the world. I made myself some dinner, simple pasta, and ate it by the fire. The crackle of the wood made the silence less heavy, and soon enough, I was feeling more relaxed. But as I cleaned up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I sat in the old chair by the fire and picked up the book I had brought with me. The pages turned slowly, the book feeling heavier as I read. The sound of the wind against the cabin grew louder, but it wasn't the wind that made me uneasy. It was the soft sound that followed it. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but I could swear I heard something else, like a tap or a scratch, coming from the direction of the window. I stood up, a bit too quickly, and walked over to the window. I pulled back the curtain, half expecting to see an animal in the yard or something else that could explain the sound. But there was nothing, just the dark expanse of trees, their branches swaying in the wind. Nothing unusual. Still, the feeling of unease lingered. I told myself to relax, to stop being paranoid, but it wasn't easy. I closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and went to bed. The bed creaked under my weight as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing down on me. Around midnight, I was half asleep when I heard it again. The sound, soft and faint, just like before. A tap, followed by a slight scraping noise. It came from the window again, and this time, I could feel my heart race. I turned toward the window, my mind racing with thoughts. Was it an animal? A tree branch hitting the glass? I got up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and walked toward the window again. This time, when I pulled back the curtain, I was ready to see something. Anything that could explain the noise. But again, there was nothing. I stood there for a moment, feeling both stupid and relieved. But as I was about to turn away, I noticed something strange. The snow outside, which had been untouched when I first arrived, had fresh tracks in it. They were faint but unmistakable footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin and then disappeared into the forest. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone out here, let alone someone walking around my cabin in the middle of the night. I had driven up alone, and there was no one else around for miles. No one but me. I quickly shut the curtain and backed away from the window. My mind raced. Who could it have been? A hiker lost in the woods? But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling the situation became. No one would be out here at this time of night, especially with the weather turning colder. And why would someone walk in a circle around my cabin before disappearing? I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, I had known there wouldn't be, but in that moment it felt like a cruel joke. Alone in the woods with someone or something outside and no way to call for help. I didn't know what to do. I thought about getting in my car and driving away, but I was too far from civilization to make it out without risking getting lost in the dark. Besides, what if the person was still out there, watching? What if they had been watching me the whole time? I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I sat by the fire, keeping a constant watch on the windows. Every gust of wind, every creak of the cabin, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever or whatever had been out there was still there, waiting. By morning, I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. But the need to leave was stronger than my fatigue. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, trying not to think about the footprints outside or what they meant. But as I stepped outside to load my car, I froze. There, in the fresh snow, were more footprints. They led up to the cabin again, then stopped. No more circles, no more wandering, just the footprints leading up to the door. I couldn't leave fast enough. I started the car, threw it into gear, and drove down the dirt road, not looking back. As I reached the main road and saw the sign for the nearest town, a sense of relief washed over me. But when I turned the corner, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A man standing by the side of the road. His clothes were old, tattered, like they hadn't been washed in days. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were hollow. He didn't wave. He didn't do anything. He just stood there, staring at me as I drove past. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I kept driving, my eyes glued to the road, my heart pounding in my chest. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who the man was or why he was out there, but I'm certain he was the same person who had been walking around my cabin. And I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone out there, and I don't ever want to be again. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The kind of quiet that only comes in places like this. The kind of quiet you don't even realize is there until it's broken. It was late October, and I had decided to get away from everything for a while. I had rented a small cabin in the woods up near a little town called Pine Ridge. I was 29 years old, an office worker who'd gotten fed up with the noise and the endless rush of city life. I wanted something isolated, something peaceful, a place where I could sit by a fire and listen to the crackling wood, far away from the calls of bosses and deadlines. The cabin was tiny, maybe not even 100 years old, but it had a charm about it. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen that seemed as if it hadn't been touched in years. A large window overlooked the thick woods, and you could see the trees just beginning to shed their leaves, their yellow and red colors painting the forest floor in beautiful patches. It was perfect. When I arrived, I unpacked my things and took in my surroundings. Pine Ridge was about an hour away from the nearest town, and I hadn't passed another vehicle in what felt like forever. I was completely alone out there, and at first that was exactly what I wanted. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest. I made myself a simple dinner of canned soup and some bread, then sat by the fire with a book. The crackling sound of the fire was comforting. But as the night grew deeper, the silence around me seemed to intensify. The wind had picked up, but it was the kind of wind that didn't move the trees. It made everything feel still and frozen. Around midnight, I started hearing strange noises from outside. At first, it was nothing more than the rustling of leaves, or perhaps an animal moving through the underbrush. But then it happened again, more distinct this time, like something heavy was walking near the cabin. It wasn't the light patter of a deer or a raccoon, but something with more weight, more purpose. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to brush it off. It's just an animal, I told myself. It's nothing. But then there was a knock. The sound was faint, barely audible over the wind. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but then it came again. 3 sharp knocks on the cabin door. My breath caught in my chest, and I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. I wasn't expecting anyone. This cabin was remote, and the rental agency had told me the nearest neighbor was miles away. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen, or maybe it was an animal knocking against the door. That made sense. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed a flashlight and moved to the door, my heart racing. I didn't open it, but I peered through the window, scanning the area outside. There was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. Just the dark woods. For a long while, I stood there, waiting, watching. The wind had died down again, leaving the world unnervingly quiet. I finally stepped away from the door, letting out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every small noise made me jump. The bed felt too big and too empty, and the darkness outside the window seemed to grow deeper with each passing minute. I woke up early the next morning, feeling drained but eager to move past whatever had happened the night before. I made coffee and sat by the fire again, watching the sun rise over the trees. The forest was waking up. Birds were calling. The wind was rustling the branches again, and all was calm. I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The cabin was set in the middle of a small clearing, and the trail behind it led deeper into the woods. As I walked, the sounds of the forest surrounded me, but it wasn't the peaceful, soothing sound I'd expected. It felt almost like the woods were watching me, waiting for something. There was an odd unease in the air, something I couldn't quite place. The further I walked, the more I noticed the little things. The broken branches on the ground, the odd marks in the dirt. There were signs of movement, of something big passing through the area, something heavy. It wasn't deer or other forest animals. These were deeper prints, as if a large person had been walking there. But who would be out here? No one should be. I kept walking, trying to push away the sense of dread that was starting to build up in my chest. But the deeper I went, the more unsettled I felt. I had no idea where the trail led, and there was no one around for miles. It was just me and the woods, and that thought felt more like a trap than a comfort. Eventually, I turned back. The air had grown colder, and the shadows were getting longer, making it feel like the world was closing in around me. I hurried back to the cabin, my footsteps quick and uneven as I tried to outrun the feeling creeping along my spine. That evening, I locked the doors and windows as soon as I got inside. The sun set earlier now, and the cabin was plunged into darkness faster than before. I lit the fireplace again, hoping its warmth would ease the strange tension in my shoulders. I didn't sleep that night. Every small sound made my heart race. I kept thinking I could hear something moving around the cabin. It was probably just the wind, but it sounded too close, too deliberate. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just alone in a strange place and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the knocking came again. This time it was harder to ignore. 3 knocks on the door, clear and unmistakable. I froze, my pulse thundering in my ears. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. I knew it wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. I grabbed the flashlight again, but I didn't go to the door. I turned the beam of light toward the window, scanning the darkness outside. Nothing. The knock came again, louder this time, shaking the door with a force that rattled the wood. My heart skipped in my chest. I felt like I was suffocating. And then, as quickly as it started, the sound stopped. The world outside was silent again, but now it felt different. More oppressive, more suffocating. I waited for hours, hoping whatever was outside would go away. But the quiet stretched on, too long, too still. At dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things, too shaken to stay another night. I didn't care if I lost the rental money. I needed to leave. The woods felt wrong, and the cabin felt like it was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me, something just beyond the trees, something that didn't want me there. I didn't even look back as I drove away, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror. I was relieved to get back to civilization, to the hum of traffic and the sound of people. The woods were behind me now, but I couldn't forget them. I don't know what was out there, or who was knocking on my door. Maybe I'll never know. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back to that cabin. The cabin stood at the edge of the forest, deep in the woods of northern Maine. It had always been a quiet spot, secluded, the perfect place for someone like me who wanted nothing but peace and isolation. I'm Alex, 28, and I'd been working non-stop for months. Long hours in a high-pressure job that left me exhausted, restless, and craving silence. When I decided to take a break, I rented the cabin, hoping it would be the perfect escape. It was late October, the time when the trees were all shades of orange and red, the air crisp with the promise of winter coming soon. The cabin was small, built out of logs that creaked with the wind but felt sturdy enough. There were no neighbors for miles, just a few scattered homes over a dozen miles away. The nearest town was even farther, tucked behind more miles of dense forest. I arrived around 6:30 p.m., just as the last slivers of sunlight were disappearing. The drive up had been long and uneventful. I didn't even see another car the entire route. The cabin had been well maintained, but I could tell it was old, maybe 60 or 70 years old. It had a charm to it that made it feel homely, even though it was so isolated. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. It was a mix of wood and dust, a scent that told me this place had been untouched for a while. I had no problem with that, though. The quiet was exactly what I wanted. I dropped my bags by the door and moved to the windows, pulling back the heavy curtains to see the forest outside. It was a wall of trees, stretching for miles in every direction. After taking a moment to settle, I started a fire in the small stone fireplace. The crackling flames filled the silence, and for a moment, I felt at peace. I had no plans to leave the cabin for the entire weekend. No plans to do anything but relax, read a book, and maybe take a hike or two if the weather was nice. As I sat there in front of the fire, I noticed something strange. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No birds, no rustling of animals, not even the sound of wind in the trees. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that began to creep up on me. I told myself it was just the isolation, that I wasn't used to such complete silence. I had spent the last few years in a city, surrounded by constant noise. By 8 p.m., The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and I went to bed. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, though the sheets felt old. I turned off the lamp beside it, letting the room go dark. I felt my body relax as I lay there in the quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I don't know how long it had been, but I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. There was a sound. It was faint at first, like a soft thud, then a scraping noise, like something dragging across the floor. My body stiffened, and my breath caught in my throat. I waited, straining my ears in the darkness. I didn't hear it again. I tried to convince myself it was just the old house settling, the wind, maybe even an animal outside. I eventually fell back asleep, but the rest of the night felt fitful. I woke up several more times, each time hearing faint noises, scraping, thuds, something that felt like movement. But when I checked the house, there was nothing. No sign of anything that would explain the sounds. The next day, I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. I walked through the woods for about 2 hours, the sun making its way across the sky, the silence broken only by my footsteps. I didn't come across anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a constant feeling, but in the moments when the wind stopped and everything went still, I felt eyes on me. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the snow outside. They weren't there before, I was sure of it. They were large, heavy prints, like someone wearing boots, but they weren't mine. My first thought was that maybe someone else had been walking nearby, but I didn't remember hearing a car or seeing anyone else while I was out. I didn't even know where the prints led. They seemed to circle the cabin in a random pattern, and then they stopped. The unease from the previous night returned, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just someone else using the woods for hiking, though I couldn't explain why I hadn't seen anyone. I decided to lock up the doors and windows, double-checking everything as nightfall came. As the night wore on, the strange noises started again. The scraping and thudding sounds, now closer and more persistent. I couldn't ignore them this time. I got out of bed and moved quietly through the cabin, checking every room. The house was empty. I checked the windows, the locks, and even the small storage room where I kept some extra supplies, but nothing seemed amiss. I felt silly, standing there in the dark, listening to the silence again, wondering if I was just overthinking things. But then the noises came again. The scrape, the thud. It was outside this time, coming from somewhere along the side of the cabin. My heart was pounding now. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly moved to the door, pulling the heavy coat around me. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but the feeling that something wasn't right was too strong to ignore. I opened the door, shining the light outside. The beams swept over the trees and the snow, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, no sign of any disturbance. I took a few cautious steps out, the cold biting at my skin. The light flicked over the ground again, and that's when I saw it. A small, dark object on the ground by the side of the cabin. I walked over to it, my heart still pounding. When I got closer, I realized it was a broken branch, splintered and bent at an odd angle, as if it had been snapped in a hurry. It was the kind of branch that could only break if someone had stepped on it with force. Someone had been out here, and they were close. I retreated back inside, locking the door behind me and pressing my back to it. My mind raced with questions. Who was out there? What did they want? I tried to keep calm, but the thought that someone else was watching me, waiting for something, made my stomach churn. I paced the cabin, looking out the windows, but saw nothing. The silence was almost deafening now. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin made me tense up, and every flicker of movement in the shadows made my skin crawl. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things, my fingers trembling as I shoved clothes and equipment into my bag. I couldn't stay another night, not with this strange feeling gnawing at me. As I was loading the last of my bags into the car, I heard the faintest sound behind me, a soft, almost imperceptible footstep. I turned, but there was nothing. The forest stood still and silent. The wind hadn't picked up, and the trees didn't rustle. It was the first time in hours that I hadn't felt like I was being watched. but something about that moment still felt wrong. I got in the car and started the engine roaring to life and cutting through the silence like a shout. As I drove away from the cabin, the road stretched ahead, winding through the trees. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road, watching me go. But the mirror remained empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, close to the cabin, and I had barely escaped. I didn't tell anyone about the strange events in the woods. I didn't need to. I knew the truth, and I had my peace again. Sometimes that's all you need. I don't know who had been watching me, or why they chose to leave me alone that night, but I never went back to that cabin. I knew better than to test my luck. Some places were best left untouched, and some memories were better left behind. I had always loved the idea of escaping the chaos of daily life. So when I stumbled across a small cabin for rent in the remote woods of North Carolina, I didn't hesitate. It was a last-minute decision, something I hadn't even really planned. But there I was, 34 years old, packing my things and heading out to a secluded spot that promised peace and quiet. I wanted to disconnect for a few days, clear my head, and enjoy nature without distractions. The cabin was nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from the nearest town. The road leading to it was barely more than a dirt path, which I took as a good sign. The less accessible it was, the more likely it was to be peaceful. I could hear the sound of my tires crunching over gravel as I made my way along the narrow, winding road, the trees pressing in on either side, creating a dark canopy overhead. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. There were no houses in sight, no signs of life except for the occasional rustling of wildlife in the underbrush. When I finally reached the cabin, it wasn't much to look at, but it had character. A small, one-story structure made of weathered wood, sitting crookedly on the edge of a clearing. The porch creaked beneath my boots as I stepped out of the car, and I took in the surroundings. The land stretched out behind it, a wild, untamed forest that seemed to go on forever. It was perfect. I grabbed my bags and went inside. The cabin's interior was just as rustic as the outside. A stone fireplace stood in one corner, with a few old, mismatched chairs and a wooden table that looked like it had seen better days. The furniture was basic, nothing fancy, but it was exactly what I had been hoping for, simple and functional. A small kitchen sat off to the side, and a narrow staircase led up to a loft where the bedroom was located. The loft had a small window that overlooked the woods. I could already picture myself sitting there, sipping coffee in the morning while the world around me stayed quiet. I unpacked my things and decided to explore the area a bit. There was a creek nearby, the sound of it faintly reaching my ears. The forest seemed alive with movement, but there was no one around for miles. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world slip off my shoulders. That night, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, I settled in front of the fireplace with a book. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the cabin, and it was oddly comforting. The shadows of the trees outside seemed to stretch long across the yard, but I didn't pay much attention. The silence was soothing, not eerie, and I figured I'd enjoy the solitude for as long as it lasted. At some point, though, I noticed something strange. It was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that felt off. The wind had stopped, the chirping of crickets ceased, and there wasn't a sound to be heard. The fire crackled, but even that sound seemed muffled. My skin prickled, and I got up to check the windows. Outside, the night had swallowed the clearing whole. There was nothing to see but the dark shapes of the trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I dismissed the feeling as my imagination running wild. After all, I was alone in the middle of the woods, and it was easy to let my mind play tricks on me. But as I made my way back to the couch, I heard something, a soft, shuffling noise from outside. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there for a moment, frozen. It was so quiet that it felt like the world had stopped, and that noise was all that existed. I waited, listening for more, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a deer, Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I made my way upstairs to the loft, trying to push the unease out of my mind. The bed was small but comfortable, and I pulled the covers over me, hoping that sleep would come quickly. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone in the cabin. It was a strange sensation, something I couldn't explain, but it gnawed at me. The darkness seemed thicker in here than it had been downstairs. I eventually fell into a restless sleep, tossing and turning through strange, disjointed dreams. When I woke the next morning, the sun was shining through the small window, casting a soft golden light over the room. I tried to shake off the strange feeling from the night before, telling myself it was just the isolation playing with my mind. I spent the next few days exploring the woods around the cabin, enjoying the peace. The days were warm, and I spent hours walking through the forest, following trails that seemed to stretch on forever. There was something peaceful about it all, the solitude, the stillness, the way the world seemed to slow down. But at night, when I returned to the cabin, I couldn't help but notice the subtle changes. The way the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too long, the way the wind would rustle the trees in a way that felt almost deliberate, and the noises. At first, I thought they were just animals, but they seemed different, more deliberate. Scratching sounds on the walls at night, faint footsteps outside the cabin. It was on the fourth night when things finally took a turn. I had just finished my dinner and was sitting by the fire, reading a book, when I heard it again. The scratching. This time it was louder, more persistent. It was coming from the outside, right against the wall of the cabin. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked to the window. There was nothing there, just the inky blackness of the woods. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, scratching at the wood. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew louder. Scratching, tapping, and then a faint thud, like something or someone was trying to get inside. I locked all the doors and windows, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it someone playing a prank? A hunter? But why? I didn't know, and that uncertainty terrified me. I spent the rest of the night staring out the windows, watching for any sign of movement, but nothing came. The next morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The feeling of being watched, the strange noises, the unease that had settled in my chest. It was too much. I packed my things and left the cabin early, barely glancing at the woods one last time before I got into my car and drove away. As I drove down the narrow dirt path, I glanced back at the cabin in the rearview mirror. It was barely visible, swallowed up by the trees, but I swore I saw a figure standing on the porch. It was just a silhouette, but I could make out the outline of a person, tall, thin, with no clear features. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. I never went back to that cabin, and I never fully understood what happened during those days in the woods. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation driving me to paranoia? Or was there something or someone out there? The question still haunts me, but one thing is certain. I've never felt the need to escape to the woods again. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It had been a rough few months, and I needed to get away from everything. The noise, the endless messages, the pressure of daily life. A weekend in a secluded cabin sounded like the perfect escape. The place was tucked away in the woods, miles from the nearest town, in a place I'd never been before. The kind of place you could disappear in. The kind of place where no one could bother you. I drove up the narrow, winding road with the sun setting behind me. The air was crisp, fresh, and a little chilly, like it always is when you start to get into the forest. As the trees grew thicker, I felt a little surge of excitement. There was something about being in the wilderness that always gave me a sense of adventure, even if I was going to be alone. I reached the cabin just as the last light of the day faded. It was smaller than I expected, tucked in a hollow between two large pines. The cabin itself looked old but solid. Weathered wood, stone chimney, a porch that seemed to sag slightly in the middle. It was perfect. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and headed inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell musty, but in a comforting way. The kind of smell you get when you're surrounded by wood and old books. The cabin had everything I needed. A small kitchen, a couple of worn chairs, a table, and a couch that looked like it had seen better days. There was a fireplace on one wall, and it was easy to imagine myself sitting there, reading a book or just listening to the crackle of the fire. I spent the first few hours settling in. I unpacked, made a quick dinner, and set up a fire in the fireplace. The light from the flames danced across the walls, casting long shadows. I sat in one of the chairs, watching the fire, listening to the occasional crack of wood splitting. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees rustle and creak. The night was coming on fast, and with it, the eerie quiet that falls when the world gets swallowed up by the woods. It was just me and the sounds of the forest now. I had no plans to leave the cabin until my weekend was over. I figured I'd spend my days reading, maybe taking short hikes, and simply enjoying the silence. But as I sat there, feeling the warmth of the fire, something began to gnaw at me. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way the trees outside swayed in the wind, their limbs scratching at the walls of the cabin like something trying to get in. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the unease. I tried to brush it off. The cabin was locked up tight, and there was no one around for miles. But the feeling stuck with me. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like a low-grade anxiety. Like something wasn't quite right, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. As the hours passed, the wind outside picked up. The trees moaned and groaned in the gusts, their branches scraping against the roof. The fire in the hearth crackled, but the sound was muffled by the wind. The occasional animal call broke the silence, but nothing too alarming. Still, the longer I sat there, the more I started to feel like I wasn't alone. It was probably just my nerves getting to me. I had been cooped up for too long, and this isolation was messing with my head. But even after I turned in for the night and pulled the covers over my head, the unease didn't go away. The darkness was complete, pressing in from all sides, and though the cabin was small and comforting, it felt distant, almost like it was closing in. I managed to fall asleep eventually, though it wasn't a deep sleep. I kept waking up, turning over, listening to the wind, the creaking of the wood. It wasn't long before I found myself wide awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the hair on the back of my neck prickle with tension. Then, at some point in the middle of the night, I heard it, a faint tapping. It was soft, rhythmic, almost like it was part of the wind, but not quite. A scratch, like someone tapping their fingers on the side of the cabin. It was so quiet, so subtle, that for a moment I thought it was just my imagination. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, straining to listen. Came from outside. The porch, maybe. I hadn't heard anything earlier, but now that I was awake, I couldn't ignore it. It was faint, but it was there. Tap, tap, tap. I got out of bed and pulled on my shoes. My mind raced, trying to come up with logical explanations. Could be an animal, I told myself. Maybe a branch or something brushing against the wood. But I wasn't sure. I went to the window, pulling the curtains aside slowly, trying not to make a sound. I scanned the area outside, my eyes searching the dark shadows where the trees met the cabin. Nothing. The tapping stopped. I stayed by the window, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I waited for what felt like hours, watching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No more tapping, no more sounds. Just the wind and the quiet hum of the forest. Eventually, I went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The tapping haunted my thoughts, and every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone, or something, standing just outside, watching me. The next morning, the sunlight streamed in through the windows, warm and comforting. I got up, made some coffee, and tried to shake off the unease that still clung to me. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. It wasn't unusual for the wind to make strange noises in a place like this. I spent the morning walking around the cabin, checking the perimeter. The door and windows were all locked, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of anyone or anything nearby. I figured I was just overthinking it, but the unease lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. I decided to take a hike that afternoon, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I walked a trail that led deep into the woods, away from the cabin. The forest was thick with trees, the ground soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. It was peaceful, calming, but there was still that nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Around midday, I came across something that made my blood run cold. It was a small clearing just beyond a cluster of rocks. In the middle of it was a pile of broken branches and logs. At first, I thought it was just a natural debris pile, but when I stepped closer, I saw something strange. A rope. It was thick, weathered, and tangled around the pile of sticks. I kneeled down, running my fingers over it. It didn't look like something that had been left by nature. It looked deliberate. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, half expecting someone to step out from behind a tree, but the clearing was empty still. I backed away slowly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. Something wasn't right. I rushed back to the cabin, my thoughts racing. Who would leave something like that out here? The cabin was isolated, but there were other houses in the area, maybe some kind of trap or signal. I couldn't ignore the fact that it felt like I was being watched. That night, the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't just a tap. It was louder, more insistent, like someone was banging on the door. I froze, heart racing. The sound was unmistakable now. Someone was on the porch. I stayed perfectly still, trying to listen. The wind outside howled through the trees, but the tapping didn't stop. It was like whoever or whatever was out there was trying to get in. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I was going to do if someone was out there. Should I call the police? I didn't even know if I had cell service out here. My mind raced with possibilities, but I couldn't just sit there. I stepped cautiously to the door, listening for any sound. The tapping stopped as soon as I moved. I cracked open the door, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The porch was empty. Nothing. Just the stillness of the night. I closed the door quickly and locked it, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. But the relief was short-lived. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't the tapping. It was something else. A feeling of being cornered, trapped, like I was being stalked, but by something I couldn't see. The forest had grown silent, and the air felt thick, oppressive. I sat in the chair by the fire, heart still pounding. It was quiet, but the silence was unnerving. Then, after what felt like hours, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't care that I hadn't stayed the whole weekend. I didn't care that I hadn't gotten the rest I needed. The unease that had settled in my chest was unbearable. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin disappearing behind me. I had no idea who had been there or why they were watching. But one thing was for sure, I wouldn't be coming back.